Welcome, friends. Welcome back to the brewery. The beer we're brewing today in this episode, I'm probably a week away from actually brewing it. Last night, Julie and I went to a winemaker's dinner. This particular winemaker brought in a group of probably about 30 people, sat us down at this big, long table, and we had like a 5 or 6 course meal, every course paired with one of their wines that they wanted to show off. And the great thing about the winemaker and their wines was every single one of the wines served last night was both amazing and a wild ferment. So what that means is that they didn't introduce any yeast into the process when they were making the wine. Wine making, beer making, any sort of whiskey or bourbon making, every maker has their own proprietary yeast that they want to use, or a very specific yeast that they want to use. So in winemaking, they will kill off all of the natural yeast that occurs on the grapes and the stems and the leaves and whatever else gets mixed in at the beginning. They'll kill that off so that they can inoculate it with a yeast that has a known property that is going to give them sort of, or help them achieve the flavor profile that they want. It's no different than brewing. You have your favorite yeast because it brings certain flavors. There are people out there who only now brew with Kveik because they think it gives them the best flavor, and that's great. Exactly how you should be brewing. Brew for yourself and your own taste buds. I came home last night thinking, I've got grapes. They grow in my backyard. It is mid-September. They're pretty much done, but there are still some out there, and they are starting to show a little bit of yeast character on the outside. There's sugar, there's yeast in the air. The yeast is starting to ferment them. I'm going to work up a starter and brew a beer later this week with this wild yeast. Now, I've used these grapes before over on the cooking channel, did the exact same process, and built up a starter and made bread. And the bread, I got to tell you, is absolutely amazing. So I know that there's some decent yeast going on out there. So I've got a starter here. This is some wort that I pulled off of another beer that I'm brewing that's in the fermenters. I pulled off a little bit of wort, and we're going to build a starter. So no real idea of what sort of flavors we're going to get from this. We're going to see what happens. So I've got some grapes with stems, and you can see that one maybe has got a little bit on it. In that goes. Cover it back up. And onto the magnetism mixer. Okay, so I'm going to let that go now for a couple of days. Once I see some signs of life in here, because I'm pretty sure I will probably crash that in the fridge and then make a double starter, just so that I can make sure that I've got enough yeast cells to start a batch of beer. Pretty excited by this. We've got a really nice layer of yeast on the bottom here, so let's move on to the next step. Okay, so when you last saw me, I put this on the stir plate. We stirred it up. It fermented. I had some pretty good fermentation. Once the fermentation was done, I stuck it in the fridge, cold crashed it to get, a layer of yeast on the bottom, decanted the liquid on top, made a second starter, exactly the same as the first, poured the yeast cake into this, again, stirred it, waited for fermentation to end, and then stuck it in the fridge to get a crash on the bottom. So I've got that nice layer of yeast there. It smells really nice. I know that I've got some good yeast in here to move on to the next step. But I also know that smells so good. It really does smell really good. It has none of the off odors that everyone warns you about, vomit and sewage and those sorts of things. I get a nice fruity, that smells really good. But I also know, as well as the yeast that I want, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there, possibly to probably completely, a whole bunch of stuff in there that I don't want. There will be other bacterias, there will be some mold in there more than likely. The next step is to get rid of all of the bad stuff and just leave us with the yeast. You could, if you wanted to, do the next step as an agar plate and just isolate down to the exact one type of yeast that you want to pull out of here. I'm hoping that there's multiple kinds of yeast in there that are going to all give slightly different flavors and work differently within the beer to give me a nice rounded, interesting flavor. So this starter is the next one. This is a 1040 starter, DME and water. When I boiled it up with some hop pellets. I wanted to get about 25 IBUs in there. Hops, one of the reasons hops are in beer, flavor of course, everybody knows about the flavor, but they also have an antiseptic quality. I want that antiseptic quality to work for us in this starter. I also put in lactic acid. The idea of the lactic acid is I wanted the pH below 4.5. I tested it, I'm down to 4.3. That's the threshold at which a lot of really bad microbes that you don't want in your beer, absolutely do not want in your beer, cannot survive at that low of a pH. I also put in some vodka. The idea of the vodka is I want this starter wort to be at 5% alcohol by volume when the yeast starts working. And as the yeast works, that ABV is only going to go up. It's not going to go up a whole lot because there's not a lot of wort to work with there, but it will go up. So between the hops, the acid, the lactic acid, the low pH, and the alcohol, we are going to eliminate or kill off most, if not all, of the really bad things. I'm also going to do this time around with an airlock. So after the initial lag phase where the yeast is going to eat the oxygen and break apart and do all of its thing, to get started, we're now going to have a CO2 environment in here, an anaerobic environment. All of this other stuff that we did, theory, should kill off all of the anaerobic bacteria so that anything that could live in an anaerobic type mixture can't survive this stuff. By putting it into an anaerobic environment, we are going to then kill off, theory-wise, all of the stuff that needs oxygen to live. But the yeast will thrive. And so we should have just a culture of yeast in this mixture at the end. I'll put this on a stir plate. I'll stir it until it's finished fermenting. And then I will stick it somewhere in the basement at room temperature, out of direct sunlight, for anywhere between 2 weeks and 28 days. Depending on which blog and scientific paper you read, you get that wide variance. I'm going to leave it probably for at least 3 weeks, let everything do its, and then we'll come back and we'll brew a beer. See you back here in a couple of weeks.
Stop your running about. It's time you straighten right out. Stop your running around, making trouble in the town. Rudy, a message to you, Rudy, a message to you. You're growing older each day. You want to think of your future, or you might wind up in jail. Then you will suffer. Rudy, a message to you, Rudy, a message to you.
Okay, so a few weeks have gone by, and obviously this worked out because we've mashed in at this point. So what I've got here is the wild yeast, and I'm just going to open this up again just to take another sniff. Smelling it earlier, I don't smell any off flavors. All of the things that you're looking for are vomit and sewage and those sorts of things. Those are, if it smells like that, you don't want to use it. This smells like beer. That's what it smells like, is beer. So I've got quite a bit of starter here. I've got a good sediment layer on the bottom, which would be a combination of some of the hops and some true, but also a yeast cake. I'm going to pour off most of this liquid before I pitch it into our beer. And so the beer we're making today is Kolsch-ish. I'm using a fairly standard Kolsch mash bill of 90% Pilsner malt, 10% Vienna malt. It's going to be a little bit lighter colored than a Kolsch is. Kolsch's are usually a little bit darker, a little bit heavier on the Vienna malt in order to get that dark color. I'm trying to go for something that doesn't have too much of a malt character because I want to test the yeast. I want to taste the yeast. I want to test and taste the yeast. I want to know what this yeast, what kind of flavors it's throwing off so that I can decide what kind of beer to use it for in the future. Maybe perfect for a Kolsch though, who knows. And so as part of that though, our hop structure is going to be pretty much the same. I'm going to use Pearl and Tettnang at a fairly moderate rate of IBUs just so that we can keep everything focused on the yeast. And to that end, on the stir plate over there, I have another yeast experiment going on, and that is White Labs Cry Havoc. And if you haven't heard of White Labs Cry Havoc, that's because they haven't sold it in a very long time under that name. They continue to sell it under a different name today, but when I bought that yeast and saved it in 2017, it's now 2024, it was called Cry Havoc. So stay tuned for that yeast experiment coming up in a future video. Okay, so 60-minute mash at 148 degrees Fahrenheit. And yeah, don't worry about that control panel on the wall just yet. I haven't started using it, just experimenting, playing around. You'll see it soon enough. Forget that it's even there. Okay, so the 1 hour mash is up. And I also did a 15-minute mash out at 172 degrees Fahrenheit. So I brought the mash temperature up to 172 and then left it there for 15 minutes. That's what the mash out is. I don't always do it. I'm on the fence as to whether it actually adds anything to the beer. Please leave your ideas down below about what it does to the beer and what it does to your mash, please. And if you notice a difference, that would be great. I'd love to know. I'm still on the fence about it. So I'm gonna pull this out. I did my initial post-mash gravity reading, and as usual, I'm about 1.5 to 2 points low from where I want to be. But I know that after I let this drain and I squeeze the bag, I'm going to get to exactly where I want to be. So I'll squeeze out the bag and we'll do the test over. Oh, I should turn up the temperature and get this starting to boil. .038, exactly what I was hoping for. And our beginning of the boil, our 60-minute hop addition, in goes the Pearl hops. And with 15 minutes left in the boil, in goes some Tettnang. And we'll also put in some yeast nutrient at this point. Okay. Hit the numbers. So I'll turn off the heat. Put in our Whirlpool edition of hops, which again is Tettnang. And we'll start up the pump. And I'm going to whirlpool this for about 15 minutes. Okay, so now it's time to chill. And I'm at a complete disadvantage here because it's a wild yeast. And I have no clue what temperature this yeast is going to like. I don't know what temperature this yeast is going to like during fermentation. So I'm going to bring it down to about room temperature, which in this basement, we're kind of early November, about 65 degrees Fahrenheit is where I'm going to try to chill this to put it into the fermenter at about room temperature. Okay, so I've poured off most of the liquid inside the flask. We'll give it a really good swirl. Oh, stir bar. I've dumped a few of those in over the years. Let's see, where is it? Magnet on the outside. Lift the stir bar out of the way and pour in the yeast. Okay, so having the giant stainless steel sink at that side over there makes cleanup a breeze. But this, being able to just hose down the floor, scrub it, and squeegee it, makes things so much easier too.
Smells nice. Color looks good.
Yes.
Waiting. I'm trying hard to wait.
So I haven't tasted it yet. I have not tasted this yet. I've
Not even in the in-between?
no.
Huh.
Oh, I kind of like that.
Uh-huh. I knew you would. Yeah, it's got a nice flavor to it.
Okay, so here's some of my notes from this.
He does take a lot of notes, which is great because then you can reference them.
Well, yeah. So we put this into the fermenter at 63 degrees Fahrenheit. The next morning, Julie and I went on vacation. We were gone for a week, forgot to turn on the furnace.
I was in that in-between time, you know.
It was in it was in early November. So when we came back from vacation, the basement was pretty cold. Inside the fermenter was 60 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's too cold.
Fermentation was not happening in the bubbler, but I drew off a sample and I checked it. Some fermentation had happened, not a lot. So then I started stepping the temperature up a little bit with an electric heater just to see if where we could get some fermentation happening. I brought the temperature up to 65, got some decent fermentation, brought the temperature up to 75, and I got much better fermentation, but it still stopped at 1029. So there's a lot of residual sugar in there. And we got 2.1 ABV. So this is a very low alcohol beer. But the flavor's there, and it doesn't come across to me as too sweet.
No. No.
Got a little bit of bitterness from the hops. It could be a little... It's not very round in flavor. Like it's not complex. There's no complexity to the flavor.
No.
Is I think where I want to go with that.
It's not complex, but the flavor that is there is a stronger and more palatable, blah, too many B's in that first version of palatable flavor than most just generic beers.
Yes, and I also think that it's been in the keg for about a week and a half at this point. I need to up the carbonation.
Yep.
It's not carbonated enough, and I know that when I up the carbonation, it will change that flavor again. And it'll bring a little bit of complexity, though, I think, when you add that. Anyway, long story short, wild yeast, great result. I've saved some yeast. I'm going to freeze it, come back in August.
When it's actually
When it's
quite
actually
hot.
quite hot. We don't have air conditioning. It'll be a little bit warmer.
It'll probably be the right temperature in here.
Yeah.
Because we're now at the point where it's now lagering temperature.
It's lagering
so
temperature.
this is
in the
traditionally when
basement.
we will do our favorite lager,
Yeah.
our Schrödinger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll do this again in the summertime at a warmer temperature. I have brewing books from the 1800s, English brewing books from the 1800s, where they talk about brewing ales at the manor house. And they were fermenting those at 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, using what would have been at that time wild yeast just gathered from the manor. So this could be a situation where we're fermenting at that higher temperature. Anyway, My next beer is going to be exactly the same grain bill, exactly the same hop schedule, but I'm going to do it with a Kolsch yeast, and we'll compare the two.
Okay. Okay.
So it'll be a wild yeast versus Kolsch yeast in the next episode for Brew 55.
5.
Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.
Message to you, Rudy. A message